Hi, my name is Fei Wyatt. I am a professional cuddler with Cuddle Sanctuary, and I'm also an intimacy coach. I'm here today to talk to you about consent, specifically why we're so bad at it. Now, I know what you're thinking, right? You're like, Fei, I'm not bad at consent, I ask. For which I want to say, okay, thank you so much. The fact that you're here listening to my video means that you actually are somebody who cares a lot about consent. So thank you for being one of those people that's making the world a safer place. And at the same time, I wanted to say that in my work as a professional cuddler, I hold a lot of people and I lead events and teach people how to hold one another. And I work with consent every single day, and I'm learning that it is very much more nuanced than simply not straight up violating another person. And because of all these nuances, I'm learning that I struggle with it too, and it surfaces in my life in a lot of different ways that are not often directly related to touch or sex. And so I thought I wanted to share with you what I've learned. And here's the thing about consent, right? It's not a very complicated concept. It's actually very simple at the core. When I say simple, I mean, it is like really, really simple to grasp. And there are all these examples of things in our culture that are a direct result of us struggling with it. So let me give you some examples of how we struggle. First of all, you've heard of rape culture, right? That's the example I think that you're thinking of right now. So the culture where objectification and violence is really normalized in our society. That might not be an area that you struggle with, but that is one that happens a lot in our society. So there's something going on that makes consent really hard for us to practice, even though it's such a basic concept. Another way that this surfaces that I have noticed is you're familiar with game playing, right? Especially in like the dating world or in relationships. How often are we like hinting and guessing and sort of like beating around the bush? Really, this is a game of manipulation. The reason why this exists is because we don't realize that there are avenues for us to get what we want by asking directly. We have to skirt around the issue. That's an example of breakdown in consent, and it's so normalized in our society, right? Another thing that is sort of a side effect of not being good at consent is salesmanship culture. It's another form of manipulation where if I want something from you, that instead of just asking for what I want and getting a yes or a no, if you say no to something, or if you're not sure, that my job is to go, oh, really? And like talk you into it and like say all of these things so that I can close the sale. And that's the only way that I can get what I want. So salesmanship culture is another one of those things that's been so normalized in our culture that shows us how we're so bad at consent. So these are just a couple of examples of the ways that we struggle. And what is consent, right? It's a very simple concept. I use three words. The first one is own. It kind of has two parts to it. So first of all, I own my body and you own your body. So I am the ultimate authority over my body and you are the ultimate authority over yours, right? So that's the first piece. The second part of ownership is actually a little bit tricky, and I think we miss this a lot when we talk about consent. The other thing that we have to own is we have to own our desires, we have to own our needs, and we have to own our pleasure. So what that means is that if I want something, I have to acknowledge that want in myself. A lot of us don't give ourselves permission to want things, and so we don't give ourselves the opportunity to ask for them. Instead of asking directly, we have to wait till somebody offers it to us. Or we have to beat around the bush and find different ways to manipulate somebody into offering that to us because we don't know how to ask. So owning what I want is a big part of being able to practice consent. So ownership over my body and owning my wants and needs. The second thing is honoring. So there's two parts to this too. The first thing that I need to honor at the very baseline is to honor your boundaries. So if you are a no to something, that it's very clear, I'm not going to push that boundary, I'm not going to manipulate you to get what I want. If you don't want to have something, then let's not do that. That's not fun for anybody. In fact, that's called rape. So let's, honor each other's boundaries. But the other part that's a little bit trickier is honoring our own boundaries sometimes. Being able to honor your own boundaries and say no when you don't want something, to speak up when you're uncomfortable, instead of going along and being agreeable and pretending to like something that you don't, right? So that's the second part, is honoring. So we've got ownership, we've got honor, and the last piece is communicating. That is That's it. In order for us to be able to connect with one another in the way that we're taking ownership of our wants and needs and communicating our boundaries and things that we don't want, it just requires us to open our mouth and communicate. So it's a very simple concept, as you can see, right? Like just 3 prongs. And yet we struggle so much. And I've been really puzzled by what is going on with us. Why are we, is it because we don't understand what consent is? I think that's a part of it. Maybe it needs to be explained. But look, I just explained it to you in under a minute, right? That's not the issue. The epiphany I got was that the reason why we struggle so much with consent is because practicing it really well requires us to be vulnerable. And when I talk about being vulnerable here, I'm not talking about having like a little fear. I'm talking about like accessing that very young, fearful place in ourselves that's like terrified. It's a terrified feeling that shows up in our body. We are terrified of being rejected. We are terrified of being alone. We are terrified of not being able to get what we want. And let's talk about all the ways practicing consent is vulnerable. When you have to ask somebody for what you want and you may not get it, that leaves you with a feeling of never being able to get what you need. And so we mask that feeling by taking before we ask, by being like hyper aggressive. And that is one of the ways we overcompensate for this vulnerability. And it gets us into a lot of hurt and pain and trouble. That's one of the ways. Another thing that is also really vulnerable is to acknowledge that you want something. We have a lot of shame sometimes wrapped around all of the things that we want and all of our desire. And that shame kind of blocks us from being able to ask directly for what we want and need. Because acknowledging that is vulnerable. It lets people in to let them know how weak we are, how much we need something, how much we want something. So what we do, we mask it again by not asking, by pretending that we don't actually need anything, and we acquiesce and we go along with things. Another way that is really vulnerable is when we are in a situation with somebody else where we don't actually want to be doing something. It's not actually something that we enjoy because we are so afraid of that boundary pushing other people away. We're afraid that if we say no, or if we say I don't want this, if we say I don't like this, what they'll end up doing is that they'll withdraw from us and remove all of the other things that we get from them that we like. And so what we do is we've learned to sort of shut up and just keep it inside and learn to like all of the things that we're given or pretend that we like them. And that causes so much problems. It causes so much resentment. It causes a lot of our needs not being met. It causes trauma. But it's vulnerable, right? It's too scary to say no, and so we don't do it. It's a lot of stuff that goes on when we're really practicing consent. What I'm learning is that the only real way for us to become familiar and comfortable and really practicing consent with like a full and whole heart is we have to make friends with this vulnerability. We have to be willing to make a request of somebody knowing that the answer might be no and feeling all of those feelings. It is freaking scary, let me tell you. When somebody does say a no, to sit with those feelings of like, oh, am I worthless? And stepping back and saying, okay, it has nothing to do with me. The other person is simply taking care of themselves. It takes vulnerability in owning what you want and what you need. It takes vulnerability in expressing that this is something that you don't want. It takes vulnerability to sit there and receive because that's what you really want. All those feelings of guilt comes up and it really just challenges your entire framework of your own worth. That is vulnerable. As a professional, it's really vulnerable for me to really trust the other person to know what they want, because what I want to be the expert, right? I want to believe that I know exactly what is right for the other person. And it takes humility and vulnerability to acknowledge that I am not the authority on the other person's body. They are. So it's terrifying practice. And it's one that is so useful, and there's so much places to grow. And when I really, make friends with this vulnerability and lean into it, all of a sudden the world becomes an abundant place. I stop feeling like it's so scarce, and I start to feel like everything that I need and want is there in front of me. All I need to do is ask. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope that you have found it useful. Please comment. I would love to hear if there was anything that was really, that really kind of rang a bell for you that you could really relate to, or maybe even something that I missed. I would love to hear about that. Thank you so much, and cuddle on.